Margaret Chen stood frozen on her Arizona porch as a blood-soaked pregnant bobcat staggered toward her, refusing to die alone in the desert. And what her 5 house cats did next shattered everything she thought she knew about the wall between wild and tame. The bobcat collapsed at her feet, and instead of fleeing or attacking, her cats surrounded the dying predator like a living shield, standing guard as if they had been waiting for this moment their entire lives. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The evening sun was bleeding crimson across the Arizona sky when Margaret Chen first heard the sound that would change everything. It wasn't the usual chorus of desert twilight, the coyotes beginning their nightly serenade, or the mourning doves settling into the mesquite trees. This was different. A low guttural moan that seemed to carry both pain and determination in equal measure. At 62, Margaret had lived on her small ranch outside Tucson for nearly 4 decades, and in that time, she had learned to read the language of the desert as fluently as she read English. This sound spoke of desperation. She set down her coffee mug on the weathered porch railing, the ceramic making a soft click against the wood that had been worn smooth by years of sun and wind. The 5 cats that had been lounging around her immediately perked up their ears. Whiskers, her oldest tabby at 14 years, let out a low chirrup of concern. Beside him, the twin orange tabbies. Sunrise and Sunset stood in unison, their tails rigid with attention. Midnight, her sleek black cat, moved to the edge of the porch with unusual urgency, while Patches, the calico who had shown up 3 years ago and never left, began pacing back and forth along the railing. Margaret's ranch sat at the edge of the Sonoran Desert, where civilization met wilderness in an uneasy truce. Her 2-acre property was ringed by saguaro cacti standing like silent sentinels against the deepening purple sky, and beyond them stretched miles of untamed land where javelinas, coyotes, and the occasional mountain lion still roamed free. She had always respected that boundary, understanding that she was merely a guest in their ancient domain. But tonight, something from that wild world was crossing the threshold into hers. The sound came again, closer now, and with it came movement. Margaret's hand instinctively went to the old ranch lantern hanging by the door, though there was still enough light to see by. What emerged from behind her tool shed made her breath catch in her throat. A bobcat, and not just any bobcat, but one in obvious distress. The wild cat's spotted coat was matted with blood along its right flank, dark stains spreading across the tawny fur. Its movements were labored, each step seeming to cost immense effort, yet the animal pressed forward with single-minded determination. Margaret had seen bobcats before, usually as fleeting shadows in her headlights or distant figures on rocky outcroppings. They were solitary, elusive creatures that wanted nothing to do with humans. But this one was heading straight for her porch, its amber eyes fixed on her with an intensity that seemed almost human in its desperation. As it drew closer, Margaret could see the extent of the injuries. Deep gashes ran along the bobcat's side, the kind that could only come from another predator, likely a mountain lion defending its territory. But there was something else, something that made Margaret's heart clench with understanding. The bobcat was heavily pregnant, her swollen belly making her gait even more awkward as she struggled forward. The domestic cats had all frozen, their instincts screaming conflicting messages. Here was a wild predator, a distant cousin who hunted creatures their size in the wilderness. Yet something in the bobcat's condition, in her obvious vulnerability, seemed to override their natural wariness. Whiskers took a cautious step forward, his ancient feline wisdom perhaps recognizing a fellow mother in need. The bobcat reached the bottom step of the porch and paused, swaying slightly. For a moment, Margaret thought the wildcat might collapse right there. But with tremendous effort, she mounted the first step, then the second. Margaret stood perfectly still, her mind racing through possibilities and protocols. She knew she should call wildlife services, that approaching a wounded wild animal was dangerous under any circumstances, but there was something in the bobcat's eyes, a desperate intelligence that seemed to be making a conscious choice to seek help here, at this porch, with these strange two-legged creatures and their domesticated cousins. The bobcat reached the porch floor and took 3 more steps before her legs began to buckle. Margaret watched in amazement as her 5 cats, rather than fleeing or attacking, began to move closer to the wild feline. Whiskers approached first, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped about 2 feet from the bobcat and sat down, his tail wrapped neatly around his paws. One by one, the other cats followed suit, forming a loose semicircle around the wounded animal. The bobcat's eyes tracked their movements but showed no aggression, only exhaustion and something that looked remarkably like gratitude. She lowered herself carefully onto the weathered planks of the porch, her breathing labored and shallow. Blood continued to seep from her wounds, pooling slightly on the wood that Margaret had swept clean just that morning. The sun was sinking lower now, painting the scene in shades of gold and amber that seemed almost deliberately dramatic, as if nature itself wanted to spotlight this impossible moment. A wild bobcat, gravely injured and pregnant, had somehow chosen this porch, this unlikely gathering of domestic cats as her sanctuary. Margaret knew she had to act quickly, but she also understood that what was unfolding here was something rare and precious, a bridge being built between the wild and the tame, between fear and trust. She slowly reached for her phone, her eyes never leaving the extraordinary tableau before her. 5 house cats standing guard over their wounded wild cousin as the desert sky blazed its final glory overhead. Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as she scrolled through her contacts, searching for the number she had saved years ago, but never thought she would actually need Dr. Helena Vasquez, the wildlife veterinarian who ran a small rehabilitation center about 40 minutes outside Tucson. They had met at a community meeting about desert wildlife preservation 3 years back, and Elena had given Margaret her card with a casual comment about calling if she ever encountered an animal in distress. Margaret had tucked that card into her phone's contacts and forgotten about it until this very moment. The phone rang 3 times before Elena's warm voice answered, slightly breathless as if she had been running. Margaret tried to keep her own voice steady as she explained the situation, though she could hear the tremor of disbelief in her own words as she described the scene on her porch. There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Margaret wondered if the connection had dropped before Elena spoke again with professional calm, overlaying obvious concern. She instructed Margaret not to approach the bobcat, not to try to touch her or move her, and to keep the domestic cats at a safe distance if possible. She would be there in 30 minutes, maybe less if traffic cooperated, and she was bringing emergency medical supplies and a transport crate designed for large wild felines. After hanging up, Margaret stood there for a moment, her phone still clutched in her hand, watching the extraordinary scene unfolding on her porch. The bobcat had settled into a position that suggested both exhaustion and wariness. Her body curled protectively around her swollen belly, despite the obvious pain it caused her wounds. The 5 domestic cats had maintained their semicircle, but something had shifted in their formation. They were no longer simply observing. They seemed to be actively guarding, their bodies positioned between the bobcat and the open stairs as if to prevent any threat from approaching. Whiskers, with his graying muzzle and wise eyes, had moved even closer to the wildcat. He was now sitting just inches from her head, and to Margaret's astonishment, the old tabby began to groom himself in that deliberate, calming way that cats do when they are trying to ease tension in their environment. The bobcat's eyes tracked his movements, but her body remained still, conserving what little energy she had left sunrise and sunset. The twin orange tabbies, who were rarely more than a few feet apart, had positioned themselves on either side of the bobcat's body, their presence creating a protective barrier. Midnight, true to her mysterious nature, had taken up a position at the bobcat's back, while Patches sat squarely at the front. Her calico coat somehow seeming like camouflage in the fading light, Margaret knew she needed to do something, anything, to help while they waited for Elena to arrive. Moving slowly and deliberately, she went inside the house and filled a shallow bowl with fresh water, then grabbed an old towel from the linen closet. When she returned to the porch, the cats had not moved from their positions, and the bobcat's eyes followed her approach with a mix of wariness and what Margaret could only interpret as hope. She set the water bowl down about 3 feet from the wildcat's head, close enough to be accessible but far enough to avoid seeming threatening. The bobcat stared at the water for a long moment before making a tremendous effort to lift her head. Her tongue, pink and dry-looking, lapped at the water with desperate eagerness. Margaret could hear the rough sound of it, the way the bobcat seemed to be pulling in every drop as if it were liquid life itself. After several long moments of drinking, the wild cat lowered her head back to the porch floor, her flanks heaving with the effort that simple act had cost her. Fresh blood seeped from her wounds, the movement having reopened whatever clotting had begun to form. Margaret carefully unfolded the towel and, moving with glacial slowness, approached the bobcat from the side where she could see her coming. The wildcat's eyes tracked every movement, but she made no sound, no threatening gesture. When Margaret was close enough, she gently laid the towel over the worst of the wounds, not pressing down or trying to bind anything, just providing a barrier between the injury and the rough wood of the porch. The bobcat's body tensed at the contact, but then, remarkably, seemed to relax slightly, as if even that small gesture of care provided some measure of comfort. The sky had deepened to indigo now, the first stars beginning to prick through the darkness overhead. Margaret settled into her old rocking chair, the one that had been her grandfather's and then her father's before coming to her, and prepared to wait. The desert night was coming alive with its usual symphony of sounds, but here on this porch there was a strange bubble of quiet, broken only by the bobcat's labored breathing and the occasional soft chirrup from one of the domestic cats. It was as if they had all agreed, human and feline alike, that this was a vigil, a sacred watch over a life hanging in the balance. The headlights swept across Margaret's property 28 minutes later, cutting through the darkness that had fully settled over the desert. Margaret watched as a dusty white pickup truck with the Southwest Wildlife Rehabilitation Center logo on its door pulled up beside her own vehicle. Dr. Elena Vasquez emerged quickly, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, wearing khaki cargo pants and a jacket despite the lingering warmth of the evening. She moved with the efficient grace of someone who had responded to countless wildlife emergencies, but Margaret could see the tension in her shoulders as she grabbed 2 large bags from the truck bed and hurried toward the porch. Elena stopped short at the bottom of the steps, her eyes widening as she took in the scene before her. The porch light that Margaret had switched on cast a golden glow over the extraordinary tableau. The wounded bobcat surrounded by 5 domestic cats who had not moved from their protective positions in nearly half an hour. For a moment, the veterinarian simply stood there, her professional composure cracking to reveal pure astonishment. She had seen many strange things in her 15 years of wildlife rehabilitation, but this defied every behavioral pattern she had ever studied or witnessed. "I have never seen anything like this in my entire career," Elena said softly, setting down her bags with careful deliberation. "Bobcats are solitary. They avoid humans and domestic animals instinctively. For one to approach a human dwelling while injured, and for domestic cats to respond this way, it goes against everything we know about feline behavior." She pulled out her phone and took several quick photographs, her scientific mind documenting what her heart recognized as something remarkable. Margaret stood up from her rocking chair, keeping her movements slow and non-threatening. "She has been like this since she arrived, losing blood but stable for now." The cats, they just gathered around her. "I have never seen them act this way, not even with each other. Whiskers there, the old tabby, he usually hisses at the mailman from 20 feet away, but look at him now." The elderly cat was still positioned close to the bobcat's head, his eyes half closed in what appeared to be a meditative state, as if he were trying to transfer his own calm to the suffering wild animal. Elena approached the porch stairs carefully, speaking in low, soothing tones as she climbed. The bobcat's eyes tracked her approach, and for a moment the wild cat's body tensed, as if preparing to flee or fight, despite her injuries. But then something extraordinary happened. Whiskers stood up and walked directly to the bobcat, positioning himself between the wild cat and the approaching veterinarian. He sat down again, this time facing Elena, and made a soft chirruping sound that seemed almost like an introduction, as if the old tabby were vouching for the newcomer's trustworthiness. The bobcat's body relaxed slightly, her eyes moving from Whiskers to Elena and back again. Elena knelt down slowly, opening one of her bags and pulling out a stethoscope and a small flashlight. "I need to examine her," she said to Margaret, "but I am going to need your help. If the cats trust you, maybe she will too. Can you sit near her head and speak softly while I work?" Margaret nodded and carefully lowered herself to the porch floor on the opposite side of the bobcat from Elena, her old knees protesting the position, but her determination overriding the discomfort. As Elena began her examination, Margaret found herself speaking in a gentle murmur, the kind of voice she used with her own cats when they were frightened or ill. "You are safe here," she told the bobcat, aware of how absurd the words might sound but feeling they needed to be said anyway. "We are going to help you and your babies. You were so brave to come here, so smart to know where to find help." The bobcat's eyes, glazed with pain and exhaustion, seemed to focus on Margaret's face as she spoke, and the wildcat's rapid breathing slowed slightly, becoming more rhythmic. Elena worked quickly but carefully, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she assessed the extent of the injuries. "The wounds are deep," she said quietly, "probably from a mountain lion attack based on the spacing and depth of the claw marks. She is lucky she got away at all. The fact that she is pregnant made her vulnerable, slower than usual." She gently palpated the bobcat's swollen abdomen, her expression concentrating intensely. "I can feel at least 2 kittens, maybe 3. They seem to be moving, which is a good sign, but the stress and blood loss could trigger early labor." "Can you save her?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can you save them all?" Elena met her eyes over the bobcat's body, and in that look Margaret saw both determination and uncertainty. "I am going to try," the veterinarian replied, "but I need to get her to the center where I have proper equipment and medications. The challenge is going to be transport. Normally, I would sedate an animal this size before moving them, but given her pregnancy and the blood loss, sedation could be dangerous. We need her to cooperate, to trust us enough to get into the transport crate without a fight." The domestic cats, who had remained remarkably still during Elena's examination, suddenly became more active. Patches, the calico, stood up and stretched before walking to the edge of the porch where Elena had left her bags. The cat sniffed at the bags, then looked back at the bobcat and made a soft, trilling sound. Sunrise and sunset moved in unison toward the stairs, as if clearing a path. Midnight repositioned herself near the bobcat's hindquarters, while Whiskers remained at his post near the wildcat's head. His steady presence seeming to anchor the entire scene, Elena retrieved the transport crate from her truck, a large, sturdy container designed for wildcats and other medium-sized predators. It was lined with soft bedding and had ventilation holes along the sides. As she carried it up to the porch, Margaret could see the veterinarian's mind working, calculating how to accomplish the seemingly impossible task of getting a wounded, pregnant wild bobcat to enter the crate voluntarily. She positioned the crate near the bobcat with its door open wide, then stepped back to assess the situation. What happened next would be something both women would struggle to adequately describe to others later, though they would try many times. Whiskers stood up and walked directly to the transport crate. The old tabby looked inside, sniffed around the entrance, then walked through the entire length of the crate before emerging from the open door at the other end. He repeated this action twice more, as if demonstrating that the crate was safe, that it posed no threat. The other cats watched this performance with what seemed like intent focus, and more remarkably, so did the Bobcat. After Whiskers completed his third walkthrough of the crate, he returned to the Bobcat and touched his nose gently to her shoulder. The wildcat's eyes, which had been growing increasingly glazed with pain and fatigue, seemed to sharpen with understanding. With tremendous effort, she began to rise, her legs shaking with the exertion. Margaret and Elena both held their breath, neither daring to move or speak. The 5 domestic cats moved as one unit, positioning themselves around the Bobcat like a living escort, supporting her without physically touching her, simply being present as she took one agonizing step toward the crate, then another. The journey from where she had been lying to the entrance of the crate was perhaps 10 feet, but it seemed to take an eternity. The Bobcat paused several times, swaying on her feet. But each time Whiskers would make that soft, chirruping sound, and she would continue. When she finally reached the crate, she hesitated at the threshold, her wild instincts no doubt screaming warnings about entering such an enclosed space. Whiskers walked into the crate one more time, settling himself in the soft bedding at the back. The Bobcat watched him for a long moment, then, with what seemed like a conscious decision to trust, she stepped inside. Elena moved swiftly but smoothly, closing and securing the crate door as soon as the Bobcat was fully inside. Whiskers, trapped inside with the wild cat, showed no sign of distress. Instead, the old tabby curled up in the corner of the crate, his purr audible even through the ventilation holes. The Bobcat settled herself as comfortably as her injuries would allow, and incredibly, she seemed calmer now than she had been on the open porch, as if the presence of the old domestic cat somehow made the terrifying prospect of confinement bearable. Margaret stared at the transport crate, her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed. Whiskers, her 14-year-old tabby who had never been more than 2 miles from home in his entire life, was now enclosed in a crate with a wild Bobcat, purring as if this were the most natural thing in the world. She looked at Elena, expecting to see alarm or professional concern about the situation. But the veterinarian's expression was one of thoughtful calculation. "Rather than worry, I think we should leave him in there for the drive," Elena said slowly, as if speaking her thoughts aloud as she formed them. "I know it sounds crazy, but she is clearly calm by his presence. If we try to separate them now, she might panic and injure herself further. The stress could trigger labor prematurely, and in her weakened condition, that could be fatal for both her and the kittens." She paused, meeting Margaret's eyes directly. "But it is your cat, your decision. I cannot guarantee his safety, though I believe the Bobcat is too injured and exhausted to pose a threat right now." Margaret looked at the remaining 4 cats on her porch, who were all staring at the crate with focused attention. She thought about how Whiskers had deliberately walked through that crate multiple times, how he had touched his nose to the Bobcat's shoulder in what seemed like a gesture of comfort and encouragement. Her old tabby had made a choice, and perhaps the most respectful thing she could do was honor that choice. "Take him," she said firmly. "But I am coming with you. I want to be there when you treat her, when we find out if she and her babies are going to make it." Elena nodded without hesitation. "I was hoping you would say that I could use an extra pair of hands, and honestly, after what I have just witnessed, I think your presence might help keep everyone calm. Let me get this crate secured in the truck, and we can head out." The 2 women worked together to carefully carry the crate down the porch steps and load it into the bed of Elena's truck, which had been specially modified with secure tie-down points for transporting wildlife. Through the ventilation holes, they could see Whiskers still curled peacefully in his corner, and the Bobcat's labored breathing seemed steadier now than it had been on the porch. Margaret quickly ran inside to grab her purse and leave food and water out for the remaining cats who had followed her to the door but seemed content to wait on the porch. As she locked up and climbed into the passenger seat of Elena's truck, she caught a glimpse of sunrise, sunset, midnight, and patches, all sitting in a neat row on the porch railing, silhouetted against the house lights like sentinels watching their companion depart on an important mission. The drive to the Southwest Wildlife Rehabilitation Center took 35 minutes along dark desert roads, where the headlights occasionally caught the reflected eyes of nocturnal animals going about their business. Elena drove with practiced efficiency, her hands steady on the wheel despite the precious and highly unusual cargo in the truck bed. She filled Margaret in on what would happen once they arrived: the emergency assessment, the wound cleaning and suturing, the IV fluids and antibiotics, the constant monitoring for signs of premature labor. The center itself was a low-slung building surrounded by various enclosures and facilities, all designed to provide medical care and rehabilitation for injured wildlife before releasing them back into their natural habitats. Elena pulled up to a side entrance marked Emergency Intake and killed the engine. Her assistant, a young man named Carlos, who had been waiting for their arrival, immediately came out to help unload the crate. His eyes widened when Elena briefly explained the situation, particularly the part about the domestic cat currently sharing quarters with their wild patient. They wheeled the crate into the treatment room, a spotlessly clean space filled with medical equipment that would not have looked out of place in a human hospital. Elena and Carlos worked with smooth coordination, having done this countless times before, though never under quite these circumstances. They carefully transferred the Bobcat from the transport crate to a specially designed examination table with high sides that would prevent her from falling if she became agitated. Whiskers, given the choice to leave when the crate door opened, instead hopped up onto a nearby counter and settled down to watch the proceedings with alert interest. Elena's hands moved swiftly as she established an IV line, her experienced touch finding the vein despite the Bobcat's thick fur and dehydrated condition. The fluid bag began dripping life-saving hydration into the Wildcat system, while Elena and Carlos worked to carefully shave the fur around the wounds. The injuries looked even worse under the bright examination lights, deep gouges that spoke of a vicious fight for survival. Margaret, stationed at the Bobcat's head as Elena had requested, continued her soft murmuring, her hands carefully positioned near but not touching the Wildcat's face, providing a focal point of calm in the midst of the medical intervention. The cleaning process was painstaking and delicate. Elena worked with tweezers to remove debris from the wounds, bits of dirt and plant matter that could cause infection if left behind. She irrigated each gash with sterile solution, her movements gentle but thorough. The Bobcat, weakened by blood loss and exhaustion, remained relatively still throughout the process, though occasional shudders ran through her body. Whether she understood that these humans were helping her or simply lacked the strength to fight was impossible to say, but the result was the same. She allowed them to work. As Elena prepared to begin suturing the deepest of the wounds, she glanced up at the monitoring equipment that Carlos had attached to the Bobcat. Heart rate elevated but steady, blood pressure low but not critical, respiration labored but regular. And then there were the readings from the small ultrasound device that Carlos had positioned on the Bobcat's swollen abdomen. 3 kittens, Elena announced, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and renewed concern, all showing heartbeats, all appearing viable at this moment. But the mother's condition is precarious. The blood loss, the stress, the injuries, any one of these factors could trigger early labor, and these kittens are at least 2 weeks from full term. Margaret found herself thinking about all the times she had watched nature documentaries, had read about the harsh realities of survival in the wild. She had always understood intellectually that life and death were intertwined in the natural world, that predators and prey existed in an eternal dance of violence and grace. But this was different. This was immediate and personal. This was a mother fighting for her life and the lives of her unborn babies. And somehow, Impossibly, that mother had made the choice to trust humans, to trust the ancient enemies of her kind in her moment of greatest vulnerability. Elena worked for over 2 hours, meticulously closing each wound with careful stitches that would hold the torn tissue together while allowing for drainage and healing. She administered antibiotics, pain medication, carefully dosed for a pregnant feline, and a vitamin injection to support the Bobcat's depleted system. Throughout it all, Whiskers remained on his counter perch, his yellow-green eyes tracking every movement, his presence a strange but undeniable source of stability in the room. Whenever the Bobcat's stress levels seemed to spike, visible in her quickening heart rate and more rapid breathing, the old tabby would make that soft, chirruping sound, and remarkably, the wild cat would calm again. By the time Elena finished the last suture, dawn was beginning to paint the eastern sky with delicate shades of pink and gold. The veterinarian stepped back from the examination table, stripping off her blood-stained gloves and tossing them into the medical waste bin with a gesture that spoke of bone-deep exhaustion. She had done everything medically possible, every wound cleaned and closed, every system supported with fluids and medications. Now came the hardest part, the waiting, the watching, the hoping that the Bobcat's own will to survive would be strong enough to carry her through. Carlos had prepared a recovery enclosure, a spacious area with soft bedding, climate control, and observation windows that would allow them to monitor the Bobcat without disturbing her. The enclosure was designed for wild animals, with hiding spots and elevated platforms that would make them feel secure while healing. Elena and Margaret worked together to carefully transfer the unconscious Bobcat from the examination table to a padded transport board, then into the recovery enclosure. They positioned her on her side in a way that would take pressure off her sutured wounds while allowing her to breathe easily. Whiskers had hopped down from his counter perch as soon as the Bobcat was moved, following the small procession to the recovery area with determined steps. When Elena opened the enclosure door to position the Bobcat inside, the old tabby slipped through before anyone could stop him. He padded across the soft bedding and settled himself near the Bobcat's back, not quite touching, but close enough that his warmth would be felt. Elena looked at Margaret with raised eyebrows, a silent question hanging between them. "I suppose there is no point in trying to separate them now," Margaret said with a tired smile. "He has made his choice clear enough." Elena nodded and closed the enclosure door, making sure the latch was secure but not locked. Allowing for quick access if the Bobcat's condition changed suddenly, she adjusted the monitoring equipment, small sensors that would track heart rate, respiration, and body temperature without requiring direct contact. The screens in the observation room would display all vital signs in real time, allowing them to watch for any concerning changes. "The next 48 hours are critical," Elena explained as they settled into chairs in the observation room. "If she makes it through without going into premature labor, if infection does not set in, if her body can heal while supporting 3 developing kittens, then she has a real chance. But I have to be honest with you, Margaret, the odds are not good. The trauma alone should have triggered labor by now. The fact that it has not is either very lucky or we are simply delaying the inevitable." Margaret watched through the observation window as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the recovery enclosure's skylights, illuminating Whiskers and the Bobcat in warm golden light. The old tabby had begun grooming himself with methodical precision, that meditative ritual that cats performed in times of stress or transition. She remembered reading somewhere that cats groom themselves not just for cleanliness, but for comfort. The repetitive motion and familiar scent, a form of self-soothing. Perhaps Whiskers was doing more than just cleaning his fur. Perhaps he was creating an atmosphere of calm, broadcasting through scent and sound that this was a safe place, that recovery was possible here. Elena went to shower and change, promising to return within the hour, while Carlos began his regular rounds of checking on the center's other patients, a young coyote with a broken leg, a great horned owl recovering from a vehicle strike, several desert tortoises being treated for various ailments. Margaret remained in the observation room, unable to tear her eyes away from the screens showing the bobcat's vital signs. Each blip of the heart monitor felt like a small victory, each rise and fall of the bobcat's chest a defiant assertion of life in the face of overwhelming odds. As the morning progressed, Margaret found herself thinking about the chain of events that had led to this moment. The bobcat must have been injured at least a day before appearing on Margaret's porch, which meant she had traveled some distance while gravely wounded, pregnant, and desperate. How had she known to come to that specific place? Had she observed Margaret's property before, seen the domestic cats, and somehow understood that where there were house cats, there would be humans who cared for felines? Or was it something more instinctual, a primal understanding that when survival hung in the balance, old evolutionary barriers needed to be crossed? Elena returned with coffee and breakfast sandwiches from a nearby diner, and the two women ate in companionable silence, their eyes never straying far from the monitors. The bobcat's vital signs had stabilized somewhat, her heart rate dropping to a more sustainable rhythm, her breathing becoming less labored as the pain medication and fluids did their work. Around mid-morning, the wildcat stirred for the first time since the surgery, her legs twitching as if she were dreaming or perhaps reliving the attack that had nearly killed her. Whiskers immediately responded to the movement, raising his head and making that soft chirruping sound that had become his signature communication with the bobcat. The wildcat's eyes fluttered open, glazed and confused, her body tensing as awareness returned, and with it, pain and fear. But then Whiskers moved slightly closer, his purr increasing in volume until it was audible through the observation room speakers. The sound seemed to work like a tranquilizer, the bobcat's body gradually relaxing again, her eyes closing as she drifted back into healing sleep. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the simple beauty of what she was witnessing. Here was proof that compassion could cross species boundaries, that the capacity for empathy existed not just in humans, but in creatures we so often dismissed as acting purely on instinct. Whiskers had no evolutionary reason to care about a wild bobcat, no genetic imperative to comfort a predator who, in different circumstances, might have seen him as prey. Yet here he was, offering his presence as medicine, his purr as pain relief. Elena was documenting everything, her scientific training demanding evidence even as her heart responded to the emotional weight of the situation. She took notes on the bobcat's responses, the timing of her brief awakening, the way Whiskers' vocalizations seemed to influence her stress levels. This was the kind of observation that could change understanding of feline behavior, could challenge assumptions about the rigid boundaries between wild and domestic animals. But more than that, it was a story that needed to be told, a reminder that the natural world still held mysteries and miracles. By evening, the bobcat had awakened twice more, each time showing slightly more awareness of her surroundings. During the second awakening, her eyes focused on Whiskers with what appeared to be recognition, and she made a soft sound that was not quite a growl, not quite a purr, something in between that spoke of acknowledgement and perhaps gratitude. The old tabby responded by carefully moving to position himself where the bobcat could see him more easily, his presence a constant reassurance that she was not alone in this strange place. Margaret called home to check on her other 4 cats, using the center's phone since her cell battery had died hours ago. Her neighbor, an elderly man named Frank, who sometimes looked after the cats when Margaret traveled, had noticed the unusual emptiness of her porch and stopped by to investigate. Margaret briefly explained the situation, and Frank, who had lived in the desert all his 78 years and understood its ways, simply said he would make sure the cats were fed and would keep an eye on things until she returned. That night, Margaret slept in a reclining chair in the observation room, refusing Elena's offer of a proper bed in the staff quarters. She wanted to be there if anything changed, if the bobcat took a turn for worse, or if somehow, miraculously, things began to improve. Elena, equally committed to monitoring their unusual patient, had set up a cot in the adjacent office, leaving the connecting door open so she could hear any alarm from the monitoring equipment. Around 3 in the morning, Margaret was jolted awake by a sound she could not immediately identify. It took her sleep-fogged brain a moment to recognize it as coming from the recovery enclosure, a low rumbling that was distinctly feline but different from anything she had heard before. She leaned forward in her chair, her eyes adjusting to the dim glow of the monitor screens as she peered through the observation window. The bobcat was awake, her body positioned more upright than it had been, and she was purring. The sound was deeper, rougher than a domestic cat's purr, with an almost rhythmic quality that seemed to vibrate through the observation room, despite the soundproofing. Whiskers, who had been sleeping curled in his usual spot near the bobcat's back, had awakened and repositioned himself closer to her front. The two cats were facing each other now, and as Margaret watched in amazement, they touched noses in a gesture that seemed both wild and impossibly gentle. The bobcat's purr increased in volume, and Whiskers added his own higher-pitched rumble to create a duet of contentment that spoke of connection beyond logic or explanation. Elena appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket and looking as stunned as Margaret felt. "She is purring," the veterinarian whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. "In 15 years of wildlife rehabilitation, I have never heard a bobcat purr. I knew they could, theoretically, but to actually hear it, especially under these circumstances." She trailed off, moving to check the monitors. "Her vital signs are improving, Margaret. Look at this, her heart rate is down to almost normal range for a resting bobcat. Her respiration is steady. Even her temperature is coming up from where it had dropped due to shock and blood loss." The two women stood together in the dim observation room, bearing witness to something that felt almost sacred in its intimacy. The bobcat and Whiskers remained in their nose-to-nose position for several long minutes, their combined purring creating a sound that seemed to resonate with something primal and ancient. Then the bobcat shifted carefully, mindful of her sutured wounds, and lowered herself back down into a resting position. Whiskers immediately curled against her, his smaller body fitting into the curve of her larger frame, and within moments both cats had drifted back into sleep. The next morning brought cautious optimism. The bobcat's wounds showed no signs of infection, the sutures were holding well, and most remarkably, there were no indications of impending premature labor. Elena performed a careful ultrasound through the observation window's access port, using a remote-controlled arm to position the device against the bobcat's belly without entering the enclosure. The 3 kittens were still viable, their tiny hearts beating steadily, their movements visible on the screen. As they shifted in their confined space, Margaret had called her neighbor Frank again, and he had brought sunrise, sunset, midnight, and patches to the center in his truck, unable to keep the cats content at Margaret's house any longer. The 4 felines had become increasingly agitated in Whiskers' absence, Frank reported, pacing and yowling and refusing to eat properly. When he opened the carrier doors in the center's lobby, all 4 cats immediately began searching for their missing companion, their noses working overtime to catch his scent. Elena made a decision that went against every protocol in the Wildlife Rehabilitation Handbook. She allowed Margaret to bring the 4 domestic cats into the observation room, keeping them separated from the recovery enclosure by the observation window, but giving them visual access to Whiskers and the bobcat. The effect was immediate and profound. All 4 cats pressed themselves against the glass, their eyes fixed on the scene inside the enclosure. The bobcat, awakened by the commotion, raised her head to observe these new arrivals. For a tense moment, Elena worried that the presence of more domestic cats might trigger stress or aggression, but instead the bobcat simply studied them with calm interest before laying her head back down. Over the following days, a routine developed that no one could have predicted. The 4 visiting cats would arrive each morning with Margaret, settling into their positions by the observation window. Whiskers remained inside the enclosure, his constant presence seeming to provide the bobcat with measurable comfort and stability. The wild cat began eating small amounts of food, carefully prepared raw meat that would support her recovery and milk production. She allowed Elena to change her bandages twice daily, though the veterinarian had to work through the access ports rather than entering the enclosure, her movements slow and deliberate to avoid triggering defensive responses. Margaret found herself becoming part of the center's daily operations, helping Carlos with feeding routines and enclosure maintenance for the other animals. She called her supervisor at the library where she worked part-time, explaining that a family emergency required her attention for the foreseeable future. Her supervisor, knowing Margaret's dedication to her cats, did not press for details and granted her an extended leave without hesitation. A week after the bobcat's arrival, Elena held a staff meeting to discuss the unprecedented situation. Besides Elena, Carlos, and Margaret, the meeting included Dr. Raymond Torres, the center's consulting veterinarian who specialized in exotic felines, and Jennifer Park, a wildlife behaviorist from the University of Arizona, who had driven up specifically to observe and document the bobcat-domestic cat interaction. The photographs and video footage had already generated intense interest in the scientific community, with several researchers requesting permission to study the case. "We are in uncharted territory here," Elena began, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. "Every instinct I have as a wildlife rehabilitator says we should be minimizing human contact and definitely not allowing domestic animals near a wild patient. But the evidence is undeniable. This bobcat's recovery has been extraordinary, and I believe the presence of Whiskers has been a significant factor in that recovery." Dr. Torres nodded thoughtfully, his years of experience with exotic cats giving weight to his opinion. "I have reviewed all the medical documentation and observational footage, and I have to agree with Elena's assessment. The stress reduction alone, measurable through cortisol levels in the blood samples we have taken, is remarkable. This bobcat should be showing extreme stress responses, yet her levels are comparable to a domestic cat in a familiar environment. The purring behavior, the acceptance of human medical intervention, the lack of defensive aggression, all of these are highly unusual for a wild bobcat and suggest that the domestic cat's presence is providing significant psychological benefit." Jennifer Park leaned forward, her eyes bright with scientific excitement. "What we are witnessing here could fundamentally change our understanding of feline social flexibility. We have always categorized bobcats as strictly solitary, but this suggests they may have capacity for social bonding under specific circumstances. The fact that the domestic cat is providing what appears to be emotional support, and that the bobcat is accepting it, indicates a level of cross-species communication and empathy that challenges existing behavioral models." The meeting concluded with a consensus that they would continue the current approach, monitoring closely for any signs that the situation was becoming detrimental to the bobcat's recovery or rehabilitation prospects. They would also begin documenting everything more systematically, creating a comprehensive record that could contribute to future wildlife rehabilitation protocols. Margaret was officially brought on as a volunteer, giving her legal standing to continue her involvement in the bobcat's care. 2 weeks into the bobcat's recovery, Elena made the decision to name her. It went against standard wildlife rehabilitation practice, which discouraged naming animals to prevent emotional attachment that might compromise the goal of eventual release. But this situation was already so far outside standard practice that Elena felt the normal rules no longer applied. She called the bobcat Sierra, after the mountain range visible from the center's windows, a name that honored her wild nature while acknowledging the unique circumstances that had brought her into their lives. Sierra's wounds were healing remarkably well, the sutures dissolving as planned and the tissue knitting together with minimal scarring. Her appetite had increased steadily, and she was now consuming amounts of food appropriate for a pregnant bobcat in her third trimester. More significantly, she had begun moving around the enclosure, testing her strength with short walks and gentle stretches. Whiskers accompanied her on these excursions, staying close but allowing Sierra to set the pace and direction. The old tabby seemed to understand instinctively when to provide companionship and when to give the wild cat space. The other 4 domestic cats had become permanent fixtures in the observation room, and Elena had brought in more comfortable furniture for them, cushioned beds and a cat tree that allowed them to observe Sierra and Whiskers from various vantage points. The daily routine had developed its own rhythm. Margaret would arrive early each morning, and the 4 cats would settle into their observation posts while she helped Carlos prepare breakfast for all the center's patients. Whiskers would emerge from the enclosure for his own meals using a small door that Elena had installed specifically for him, then return to Sierra's side once he had eaten and used the litter box. What fascinated Jennifer Park most, as she continued her observations and documentation, was the way the domestic cats had organized themselves into what appeared to be a support system. Sunrise and Sunset, the orange twins, took turns at the observation window as if they were sharing watch duties. Midnight spent hours grooming herself near the window, her presence calm and meditative. Patches, ever the observer, had claimed the highest perch on the cat tree, from which she could monitor both Sierra in the enclosure and the activity in the observation room. It was as if they understood they were part of something important, something that required their continued presence and attention. As Sierra entered her final week of pregnancy, based on Elena's calculations from the ultrasound measurements, the atmosphere at the center became increasingly tense. The kittens would need to be born soon for optimal survival chances, but every day that Sierra remained pregnant, while continuing to heal from her injuries, was a day that reduced the risk of complications. Elena had prepared a nesting box within the enclosure, a secluded area with soft bedding where Sierra could give birth with some privacy, though the monitoring equipment would still track all vital signs. Sierra showed increasing interest in the nesting box, investigating it multiple times each day and occasionally settling inside for short periods. Whiskers, who had been given access to the entire enclosure, seemed to understand that this particular area was significant. He never entered the nesting box himself, but he often positioned himself just outside it, as if standing guard. The dynamic between the bobcat and the old tabby had evolved into something that resembled a deep friendship, 2 beings who had found comfort and purpose in each other's company despite every evolutionary reason to be antagonists. Late one evening, 17 days after Sierra's arrival at the center, Margaret was reading in the observation room while the 4 cats dozed around her. Whiskers had eaten his dinner and was preparing to return to the enclosure when Sierra made a sound that brought everyone to immediate attention. It was a low yowl, distinctive and unmistakable to anyone who had ever been around a cat giving birth. Elena, who had been reviewing medical charts in her office, appeared in the observation room doorway within seconds, her expression a mixture of excitement and concern. "It is time," she said simply, moving to check the monitors. "Her contractions have started, Carlos. Alert the night staff and make sure we have everything ready for potential complications. Margaret, I know you want to stay, but I need you to keep the other cats calm and out of the way." Whiskers. She paused, looking at the old tabby who was standing at the enclosure door, clearly wanting to go to Sierra. "I think he needs to be in there with her." The decision was controversial even in the context of their already unprecedented situation. Allowing a domestic cat to be present during a wild bobcat's labor was so far outside normal protocols that Elena would have to answer for it later. But watching Sierra's distressed pacing, seeing how she kept looking toward the door where Whiskers waited, Elena made the choice based on instinct rather than procedure. She opened the door and Whiskers immediately went to Sierra, touching his nose to her shoulder before following her into the nesting box. What followed was a labor that lasted through the night and into the early morning hours, Sierra's contractions were strong but irregular, and Elena monitored carefully for signs of dystocia or other complications that would require intervention. But Sierra's body, despite the trauma it had endured, seemed to know what to do. Between contractions, she would rest her head against Whiskers, who remained motionless beside her, his purr a constant rumble of encouragement and comfort. The first kitten was born just after midnight, a tiny spotted bundle that Sierra immediately began cleaning with vigorous licks. The kitten's cry was surprisingly loud for something so small, a high-pitched mewl that announced its arrival to the world. Elena and Margaret watched through the observation window, tears streaming down both their faces as they witnessed this miracle of life emerging from such unlikely circumstances. Whiskers, still in the nesting box, carefully moved to give Sierra room to tend to her newborn, but he did not leave. The second kitten arrived an hour later, and the third 90 minutes after that each time. Sierra repeated the cleaning process with the same maternal intensity, stimulating the kittens to breathe and nurse. By the time dawn light began filtering through the skylight, 3 healthy bobcat kittens were nursing while their mother rested, exhausted but alert. Whiskers had positioned himself at the entrance to the nesting box, his body creating a living barrier between the new family and the outside world. Elena conducted an assessment through the remote-controlled ultrasound, confirming that Sierra had delivered all 3 placentas and that there were no remaining kittens. The new mother's vital signs were strong, her maternal instincts fully engaged as she carefully arranged her babies and cleaned each one thoroughly. The kittens, 2 females and 1 male based on the brief glimpses Elena had managed during the births, appeared healthy and vigorous, their nursing instincts strong and their vocalizations normal. Margaret stood at the observation window, her 4 cats pressed against the glass beside her, all of them watching the scene in the nesting box with rapt attention. Sunrise and sunset were making soft, chirruping sounds as if calling congratulations to their old friend Whiskers. Midnight had her front paws on the glass, her black face intent with interest. Patches from her high perch surveyed the scene with what Margaret could only interpret as satisfaction, as if the calico had known all along that this moment would come. The first 48 hours after the birth were critical, Elena explained to Margaret as they maintained their vigil in the observation room. Newborn bobcat kittens were entirely dependent on their mother, born blind and deaf with only their sense of smell to guide them to warmth and milk. Sierra needed to bond with them to establish nursing routines and to demonstrate the maternal behaviors that would determine whether her kittens thrived or failed. The fact that she had given birth while recovering from severe injuries added layers of complexity to an already precarious situation. But Sierra proved to be a devoted mother. She rarely left the nesting box during those first days, only emerging briefly to eat the food that Carlos carefully placed just outside the entrance, or to use the designated area of the enclosure. Whiskers had taken on the role of guardian, positioning himself outside the nesting box in various locations that gave him clear sight lines to both the entrance and the main enclosure door. When Sierra did emerge, the old tabby would slip into the nesting box, apparently checking on the kittens before rejoining Sierra when she returned. Margaret observed this behavior with amazement, recognizing in Whiskers something she had read about but never expected to see: alloparenting, where an individual helps care for offspring that are not their own. In the wild, this behavior was sometimes seen in social species like lions or wolves, but bobcats were solitary animals, and domestic cats, while capable of raising kittens together if they were related or bonded females, rarely showed such dedication to the offspring of other species. The kittens grew rapidly, their tiny bodies doubling in weight within the first week. Their eyes began to open around day 10, revealing the blue-gray color that would eventually change to the golden amber of adult bobcats. Their ears, which had been folded flat against their heads at birth, began to unfold and perk up, allowing them to hear their mother's soft chirps and purrs. The spotted pattern of their coats became more distinct as their fur grew in, each kitten displaying the beautiful rosettes and stripes that would provide camouflage in their natural habitat. Dr. Torres came to examine the kittens when they were 2 weeks old, a delicate operation that required separating Sierra from her babies. For the briefest possible time, Margaret and Elena worked together to lure Sierra from the nesting box with fresh food, while Torres quickly but thoroughly checked each kitten. All three were healthy, their weight gain appropriate, their muscle tone good, their eyes and ears developing normally. The male kitten, slightly larger than his sisters, had a particularly bold personality, mewing loudly in protest at being handled. The two females were quieter but equally vigorous, their tiny claws already sharp enough to prick through Torres's examination gloves. When Sierra was returned to the nesting box, she immediately counted her kittens, touching her nose to each one before settling down to nurse them. Whiskers, who had been pacing anxiously outside the enclosure during the examination, visibly relaxed once the family was reunited. Margaret could not help but think of him as the proud grandfather, his whole demeanor radiating protective concern for these wild babies who had been born under his watchful presence. As the kittens reached 3 weeks of age, they began to explore outside the nesting box, their wobbly steps gradually becoming more coordinated. This was the stage that concerned Elena most from a rehabilitation standpoint. Bobcat kittens needed to learn wild behaviors from their mother, needed to develop the instincts and skills that would allow them to survive once released. The presence of domestic cats and humans during this critical learning period could potentially compromise their wildness, making them too comfortable around people and thus unable to thrive in their natural habitat. Yet Sierra herself was providing a masterclass in maintaining boundaries. She allowed the monitoring and basic care that kept her and her kittens healthy, but she had never become tame or overly friendly toward the humans. When Elena or Carlos needed to enter the enclosure for cleaning or medical checks, Sierra would move her kittens to the back of the nesting box and position herself between them and the humans, her body language making it clear that while she tolerated this intrusion, she did not welcome it. This was exactly the behavior Elena wanted to see, a wild animal accepting necessary human interaction without losing her essential wariness. The relationship between Sierra and Whiskers, however, remained extraordinary. The old tabby was the only being, human or feline, that Sierra allowed near her kittens without defensive posturing. Whiskers would groom the kittens when Sierra left to eat or drink, his rough tongue working over their fuzzy coats with the same gentle thoroughness he used on his own fur. The kittens responded to him with complete trust, climbing over him and chewing on his ears with their needle-sharp baby teeth while he bore it all with patient dignity. Margaret's other 4 cats continued their daily vigil at the observation window, and a strange dynamic had developed. The kittens seemed to recognize the presence of the domestic cats on the other side of the glass, often pressing their tiny paws against the window from inside, while sunrise, sunset, midnight, or patches pressed back from outside. It was as if the domestic cats were providing a sort of extended family structure, a broader feline community surrounding these wild babies in their vulnerable early weeks. Jennifer Park had been documenting everything, and her preliminary analysis suggested that what they were witnessing was a rare example of interspecies cooperation driven by what could only be described as empathy. Whiskers had recognized Sierra's distress and vulnerability, had made a choice to help, and had maintained that commitment even as it required him to live away from his own home and humans. Sierra, in turn, had accepted that help in a way that challenged every assumption about bobcat behavior and social capacity. The story had begun to attract media attention, carefully managed by Elena to protect Sierra's privacy and eventual rehabilitation prospects. A local news station had done a brief segment, focusing on the miraculous survival of the injured pregnant bobcat, rather than dwelling too much on the unprecedented relationship with the domestic cats. The response had been overwhelming, with donations pouring into the rehabilitation center and messages of support arriving from around the world. People were hungry for good news, for stories that showed compassion and connection, triumphing over the harsh realities of nature. As the kittens approached 4 weeks of age, Elena and her team began discussing the long-term plan. Sierra's wounds had healed completely, leaving only faint scars beneath her fur. She was strong and healthy, fully capable of caring for her kittens and eventually returning to the wild. But the timeline for that return had become complicated by the very factors that had saved her life. The kittens would need at least 3 months with their mother before they could be weaned, and during that time they would need to learn hunting and survival skills that could only be taught in an environment more natural than the recovery enclosure. The solution came from an unexpected source. The rehabilitation center owned 50 acres of protected land adjacent to the main facility, originally intended for soft release programs where animals could transition gradually back to wild living before being moved to their final release sites. Elena proposed converting a large section of this land into a specialized enclosure for Sierra and her kittens, a space that would provide natural terrain, native plants, and opportunities for the mother to teach hunting skills, while still allowing for monitoring and intervention if needed. The construction took 3 weeks, with volunteers from the local community donating time and materials to create what was essentially a slice of wild Sonoran desert, enclosed by high fencing designed to be invisible from inside. Natural rock formations provided denning opportunities, native vegetation offered cover and hunting grounds, and a small spring-fed stream supplied water. Live prey would be introduced gradually, starting with insects and working up to small rodents, allowing Sierra to demonstrate hunting techniques to her growing kittens in as natural a setting as possible. The transition to the new enclosure happened when the kittens were 6 weeks old, their eyes fully opened to their golden adult color, their legs steady and strong, their personalities emerging distinct and bold. The male, whom Elena had begun calling Scout, for his tendency to explore first and farthest, was fearless and curious. The 2 females, dubbed Shadow for her darker coat and Grace for her particularly elegant movements, were more cautious but equally intelligent. All 3 had reached the stage where they needed more space to develop properly, more challenges to stimulate their wild instincts. Moving day was complex and emotional. Sierra was briefly sedated, just enough to allow safe transport without excessive stress, and the 3 kittens were carried in a specialized box that kept them together and calm. Whiskers, who had been informed of the change in his own way through Margaret's gentle explanations and the preparation activities he had observed, seemed to understand that something significant was happening. When the transport was complete and Sierra was placed in the new enclosure with her kittens, Whiskers stood at the observation window of the old recovery room, watching the empty space where his friend had been. Margaret's heart broke watching the old tabby search for Sierra, his confusion evident in his wandering paths and questioning meows. She gathered him into her arms, something he normally tolerated rather than enjoyed, but this time he pressed against her chest and began to purr, though it sounded more like grief than contentment. The other 4 cats, sensing their companion's distress, surrounded Margaret and Whiskers in a group comfort session that lasted well into the evening, but Elena had planned for this too. The new enclosure had observation points that allowed both human and feline visitors to watch Sierra and the kittens without disturbing them. Over the following days, Margaret brought all 5 of her cats to these viewing areas, and Whiskers would sit for hours watching Sierra teach her babies the ways of their kind. The bobcat mother seemed to sense his presence, occasionally looking toward the observation point and making a soft sound that might have been acknowledgement or greeting. The kittens thrived in their new environment. Within days, they were climbing rocks, pouncing on insects, and following their mother through the brush as she showed them how to move silently, how to read scent trails, how to choose the best spots for ambush hunting. Sierra caught live mice and released them injured, but alive in front of the kittens, allowing them to practice their pouncing and killing techniques. It was raw and brutal and absolutely necessary for their survival, and Margaret had to remind herself that this was nature, that these skills would mean the difference between life and death. Once the family was released into true wilderness, Whisker's visits to the observation area became part of the daily routine. Margaret would bring him in the morning and again in the evening, and he would watch Sierra and the growing kittens with an attention that seemed almost meditative. Sometimes Sierra would bring the kittens close to the observation window as if showing them off to the old tabby who had been present for their birth. The kittens, now bold and playful, would bat at the glass, trying to reach the cat on the other side who looked so different from their mother, but who seemed important somehow. As summer deepened into fall, the kittens grew rapidly, their spots becoming more defined, their bodies lengthening and strengthening. By 3 months of age, they were already showing the independent streak that characterized bobcats, spending more time away from Sierra, exploring on their own while she rested in the shade. This was normal development, the gradual loosening of the maternal bond that would eventually allow them to disperse and establish their own territories. Elena began planning for the final release, scouting locations in protected wilderness areas where bobcat populations were stable but not dense, where the youngsters would have the best chance of finding unclaimed territories and establishing themselves successfully. The plan was to release Sierra first, allowing her to scout the area and establish a temporary territory, then release the kittens one at a time over the following weeks. This staggered approach would prevent sibling competition while giving each young bobcat the benefit of their mother's initial guidance in truly wild conditions. Margaret knew this day was coming, had known from the beginning that the goal was always to return Sierra and her kittens to where they belonged, but knowing intellectually that release was the right outcome and accepting emotionally that she would never see these animals again were two very different things. She had watched these kittens grow from helpless newborns to competent young predators, had witnessed their mother's remarkable recovery and maternal devotion, had seen her own cats form bonds that defied every logical explanation. The decision of what to do about Whisker's involvement in the final release became a source of considerable debate among the rehabilitation team. Jennifer Park argued that allowing the old tabby to be present might provide continuity and reduce stress for Sierra during the transition. Dr. Torres worried that it could complicate the release process or create confusion about the boundary between captive care and wild living. Helena, as always, tried to balance scientific protocol with the unprecedented nature of their situation, recognizing that there was no textbook answer for circumstances that had never occurred before. In the end, it was Sierra herself who seemed to make the choice clear. As the release date approached and the team began acclimatizing her to the transport crate that would take her to the wilderness site, she became increasingly agitated and resistant. But when Whiskers was allowed into the transition area, Sierra immediately calmed, entering the crate without hesitation when the old tabby walked through it first, in his familiar demonstration of safety. It was as if she trusted his judgment, understood that if he approved of this strange box, it must lead somewhere acceptable. The release site was in the Coronado National Forest, a rugged stretch of mountains and canyons where the desert met pine forest at higher elevations. Elena had chosen this location carefully, consulting with wildlife biologists and reviewing territorial maps to find an area with suitable habitat and minimal human presence. The spot she selected was accessible enough for the release team to reach, but remote enough that Sierra and her kittens would have space to establish themselves without encountering hikers or campers. Margaret made the journey in Elena's truck, with Whiskers in a carrier on her lap and the other 4 cats secured in the back seat. It was an unusual procession, the rehabilitation center's transport vehicle carrying Sierra and her 3 nearly grown kittens, followed by this truck full of domestic cats who had somehow become integral to one of the most remarkable wildlife rehabilitation cases in modern record. Dr. Torres and Jennifer Park followed in a 3rd vehicle. bringing equipment to monitor the release and document these final moments. The November morning was crisp and clear, the sky that brilliant blue that only came with the approach of winter in Arizona. They arrived at the site just after dawn, when the light was soft and golden, painting the landscape in shades of amber and rose that reminded Margaret of that first evening when Sierra had appeared on her porch. It felt like a lifetime ago, though only 5 months had passed since that desperate bobcat had made the choice to cross the boundary between wild and human, between solitary survival and trust. Elena and her team worked efficiently to position Sierra's transport crate in a clearing surrounded by boulders and manzanita bushes, creating natural cover for the bobcat to use once she emerged. The kittens would be released separately over the next 2 weeks, giving Sierra time to scout and establish a safe area before her youngsters joined her. Margaret stood back with her cats, Whiskers pressed against the carrier door as if he could somehow get closer to Sierra through sheer force of will. When everything was ready, Elena opened the crate door and stepped back. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just the sound of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a raven. Then Sierra appeared at the entrance, her spotted coat magnificent in the morning light, her body healthy and strong, showing no trace of the terrible injuries that had nearly killed her months before. She paused at the threshold, her amber eyes scanning the landscape with the careful assessment of a wild predator, evaluating new territory. Margaret had wondered if Sierra would hesitate, if she would look back at the humans who had saved her life, if there would be some moment of acknowledgement or farewell. But Sierra was a wild animal, and her focus was entirely forward, on the forest ahead, on the scents and sounds that spoke of prey and water and shelter. She stepped from the crate with fluid grace and moved into the underbrush, disappearing within seconds, as if she had never been anywhere but here, as if those months of captivity and recovery had been only a brief interruption in her wild existence. But then something unexpected happened. From somewhere in the trees above the clearing came a sound, that deep, rough purr that Margaret had first heard in the recovery enclosure at 3 a.m, when Sierra had touched noses with Whiskers in a moment of interspecies connection that had defied all logic. The purr echoed through the forest for perhaps 10 seconds, a sound of acknowledgement or perhaps gratitude, before fading into silence. Whiskers in his carrier responded with his own higher-pitched purr, and Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she witnessed this final exchange between the wild bobcat and the domestic cat who had become her unlikely guardian. Elena was crying too, and Dr. Torres had turned away to wipe his eyes, and even Carlos, who prided himself on professional detachment, was sniffling as he checked the monitoring equipment. They stayed at the site for another hour, ensuring that Sierra had truly departed and was not lingering nearby in a way that might indicate problems with the release. The cameras they had positioned would track her movements over the coming weeks, allowing them to verify that she was successfully hunting and establishing a territory. Eventually, they would do the same for the kittens, monitoring to ensure all 4 bobcats made the transition from rehabilitation to wild living successfully. On the drive back to the center, Margaret held Whiskers on her lap outside his carrier, stroking his soft fur and feeling the steady thrum of his purr beneath her fingers. The old tabby seemed tired but content, as if he understood that his mission was complete, that the wild cat he had protected and comforted was now back where she belonged. The other 4 cats were unusually quiet, perhaps sensing the significance of what had just occurred, or perhaps simply reflecting the emotional weight that filled the truck. In the weeks that followed, the monitoring cameras captured Sierra hunting successfully, establishing a territory, and eventually welcoming each of her kittens as they were released into her area. Scout, true to his personality, dispersed quickly to establish his own territory several miles away. Shadow and Grace remained closer to their mother for a while before gradually moving off to find their own spaces in the wild. By spring, all 4 bobcats were living independent lives, contributing to the genetic diversity and ecological health of their species. Margaret's life returned to its normal rhythms, her 5 cats resuming their positions on her porch in the desert twilight, watching the sun paint the sky in colors that would never cease to amaze her. But something had changed, some fundamental understanding about the boundaries between species, about the capacity for compassion and connection that existed across evolutionary divides. Whiskers never quite lost the slightly distant look he sometimes got, as if remembering another cat, a wild one who had trusted him with her most vulnerable moments. The story of Sierra and Whiskers became part of wildlife rehabilitation lore, cited in academic papers and taught in veterinary schools as an example of how flexibility and compassion could sometimes achieve results that rigid protocol never could. But for Margaret, sitting on her porch each evening with her 5 cats around her, the lesson was simpler and more profound. In a world that often seemed divided and hostile, there was still room for trust, still possibility for bridges to be built between different worlds, still hope that when survival hung in the balance, kindness could make all the difference. The desert night would deepen around her, and somewhere out in that vast darkness, 4 bobcats who should never have survived were living their wild lives, carrying with them a story that defied explanation but demanded to be told.